This is an oral history interview with Jessie Morgan in her home on January 24th, 1983. The interviewer is Susan Gortner. Mrs. Morgan, where was your father born and what was his name?
My father was born in West Virginia, and his name was William Borror.
And your mother?
My mother was Martha Ellen Neff, and she was born at Ludlow, Illinois.
When did your father come west?
He came to Champaign County, Illinois in 1880.
How did he get here, do you know?
He came by train, was one of the first people to ride on the train that came from West Lebanon, Indiana, clear through to Keokuk, Iowa.
What made him come to Illinois?
Well, he came here as a young man. He came to Indiana, eastern Indiana, as a young man, 18 years old, to visit a cousin. And he liked it well here and came on out to Penfield, Illinois to visit a friend and stayed.
What type of work did he do?
He was a farmer. He worked first as a farmhand and then in 1885 started farming for himself.
Where was the farm located?
Near Penfield, Illinois.
How big a farm was it?
Oh, I don't know. It was probably 200 acres.
Did you grow up on the farm?
Not on that farm. Before I was born, my family moved to Vermilion County, and I grew up on a farm until I was 9 years old.
What type of schooling did your father have?
He had grade school.
And your mother?
My mother had grade school and started teaching school when she was 16 years old. Mm-hmm. She attended the University of Illinois in summer sessions.
Where did she teach school?
Near Penfield.
Mm-hmm. And that's where they met?
That's where they met.
What's the ancestral origin of your father's last name?
It's English and Dutch.
Do you know when your first ancestors came to the United States on his side?
Well before the Revolution.
How about on your mother's side?
My mother's family were Scotch-Irish from Ireland, but they were from the north of Ireland. And her father, who was born about 1830 in North Carolina, so the family must have come around 1800 to the Carolinas.
Did your mother ever work outside the home?
No. Well, when she was first married, she taught school a short time, but otherwise, no.
How many were in your family when you were growing up?
There were 7 of us.
How many boys and girls?
3. I had 3 brothers and 3 sisters.
Where did you fall in?
I was the youngest one.
You were the youngest.
Much younger than the rest.
Uh-huh.
And spoiled.
What types of games did you play with your brothers and sisters as you were growing up?
Well, really, my brothers and sisters most of them were so much older than I were that I didn't have much companionship.
What did you do for entertainment then?
Oh, played with the neighbor children on the farm, and one thing that my sister, who was 4 years older than I, used to do, we played house in the backyard, and where the grass was worn off, we would sweep and make rooms, and I remember that very distinctly, and mark the rooms off with twigs and all, and we had fairly good houses, we thought, to play in.
Did you help with chores on the farm?
Oh, yes.
What were your responsibilities?
Well, I had to carry in coal and cobs and hunt eggs and do most anything.
Did you help also with the cooking?
Washing and drying the dishes. When I was 4 years old, I cried to wipe the knives and forks, and then I cried after that because I had to.
What type of kitchen did your mother have? Can you describe it briefly?
Well, she had we lived in 2 different, on farms, we lived in 2 different places. One the one they moved into before I was born was a large house And my father farmed about 800 acres of land in an estate that belonged to some people in Chicago. And this was near Potomac, Illinois. And it was a large house and a great big kitchen, and I remember a great big living or dining room. And we always had a lot of hired men, and there were quarters in the house upstairs for the help to live in. They lived with us year round. Many of the houses in that day, especially the larger houses on the larger farms, had quarters for the help.
Did they have a separate entrance, or did they come right through the...
No, there was the back stairway, which everybody used.
How many hired men did you have?
Well, we'd have 4 and 5 and maybe 7 and 8 during the harvest time.
Did your mother have any cook helping, any help with the cooking besides?
Well, my older sisters helped.
You never had a lady come in, or...
Not as I grew up, when the older ones were smaller, my mother had a hired girl, but I can't remember of having a hired girl.
Did you ever have anybody live with your family besides the hired men, the grandparents?
No, they visited. One grandmother in particular, used to visit us a lot, but no, we didn't have any live-ins.
Where did you go to school?
Well, I went to a country school near Rossville, and then I went to the Rossville Public Schools and the Rossville High School. And then I went to Utterback's Business College in Danville, and then I went to Indiana University, where I got an A.B. degree and did some graduate work in political science.
In your country school, how did you get to school? How far were you?
I was 1.25 miles through the field, and we walked through the fields to the school, and many a time in the wintertime the snow was so deep that we walked up over the edges. The school lane was always closed with snow, and it was wonderful.
Did you carry your lunch?
Oh, yes.
What type of lunch did you take?
Well, each of us, at that time, my brother, who was 8 years older than I, and my sister was 4 years older, and we all went to, when I first started to school, we all went to school. And each of us had a half-gallon Karo syrup bucket that my mother filled with real good things to eat. And then she had the third one, and usually it was my brother had to carry it, was a gallon bucket, and he not only had his lunch in that, but he carried the apples or the pie or all the extra good things. And I well remember that some neighbor kids used to come along and walk with us to school, and there were the usual fights, and they'd bang each other over the head with their dinner buckets. But the meal always got to school, and my mother worried and worried because it would be so cold that our lunches would freeze. Well, we'd take them to school and set them around the big pot-bellied stove, and they'd thaw out. And we ate them at recess time. We couldn't wait till noon. And now the mothers freeze the food for their children's lunches. But my mother was way ahead of that, but didn't know it.
Doing it, she didn't realize.
I know.
When you went to college, did you pay your own way?
I worked quite a bit.
What kind of job did you have?
I worked for the university. I worked in the athletic department dispensing football and basketball tickets in seasonal work, and then after my sophomore year I worked as an assistant in the political science and in the geography department. I graded papers and gave exams and did work for the professors.
What inspired you to want to go on to college?
Well, it was just accepted that we would go to college.
Did your sisters go also?
My one sister and my brother. The older ones did not go, but they were older. But
what's besides your jobs in college? Did you have a job before that?
Yes, I started when I was 13 years old, working on the Rossville Press, the weekly newspaper. I worked after school and on Saturdays.
What did you do?
Well, I wrote news, got news, and took care of the mailing lists and did anything there was to do. I was the printer's devil, I guess you'd say. And I kept that up for 58 years in newspaper work. That's what got me interested in newspaper work. Although when I went to college, I had all the plans in the world to be a mathematics teacher.
But that didn't last.
Well, I found that journalism was more to my liking. Although I got my degree in history.
How did you happen to start working on the Rossville paper when you were so young? Did it just appeal to you, or?
Well, the editor of the paper I suppose he went to school and asked for somebody, I don't know, and he came and asked if I'd like to do it. And I had written some things, and I had won the bank, the National Bank of First National Bank in Monticello, or in Rossville, had offered a $10 savings account for the best Mother's Day essay. And we went to English class, and the teacher said, everybody will write an essay on Mother's Day. We had no forewarning of it and everything, so I just sat down and wrote it, and they liked it. I won that. That was my first banking experience, to have a $10 savings account. And I guess that might have started me out.
With the money that you earned working on the paper, then, did you get to keep it yourself, or what did you do with your earnings?
Oh, I saved it to go to college.
After you got out of college, what did you do?
Well, it was the Depression, the depths of the Depression, and for some time I did nothing but stay at home and help my parents and do what odd jobs I could get to do. And several times I edited the newspaper for the editor. If he had to be out of town, he would come and have me put the paper out. And then in 1933, then I went to work for the Danville Commercial News.
What was your job there?
Well, I was a reporter and assistant society editor, and I had the one thing that brought me the most attention from the public and all was I had a children's page each Sunday in the paper, and the children contributed things for the page, and we had a great time with that. And every Saturday afternoon I would go to the movie, and the children would pay a nickel a piece to get in. Of course, you were lucky to have the nickel. And we had, Mickey Mouse was quite big at the time, and we had a Mickey Mouse club. And everybody who came on Saturday afternoon, before the regular afternoon show, they had this Mickey Mouse club meeting. And we would have different children come and entertain. And one of our entertainers, and I'm very proud to have helped this young man along in his career, was Donald O'Connor. He and his sister came to Danville to stay with their grandparents because their parents, who were in show business, and the grandparents had been in show business, they came to Danville to stay with them because their parents were out of work. And of course they wanted to keep the children in the limelight, and he wasn't very old then. I suppose 7 or 8 years old, maybe, about 7 or 8. And he was very, very clever at that time, and more so than the sister was quite a good dancer, but she didn't have the show pizzazz that he did. And they came and asked if they could, the grandparents came and asked if they could entertain, and we said, why, of course. And every time they would put on some kind of an act. And
that's an interesting experience.
I haven't heard from him for a good many years, but I used to have some correspondence with him. But
so you gave him his start.
Well, I felt that maybe that little boost that he got there while he was what he needed.
Did you have a hard time making ends meet during the Depression? Your family?
Making what?
Making ends meet during the Depression?
No. Well, my father had a dairy. I was the only one at home, and we didn't have everything, but we never wanted for anything. No.
To go back just a little bit, how did World War I affect your family?
Well, very much. You see, my three brothers, my brother-in-law, were all in World War I. And my mother had the honor of having the most stars in the service flag in our town. And then my youngest brother, who was only 18 years old, was wounded. He served with the 5th Marines and was wounded quite badly. He came home and went to the University of Illinois, graduated with honors in mining engineering, and went on to be a mining engineer with the Johns Mansfield Company and worked till he was way past the retirement age, because they kept him. They finally made him, when he wasn't able because of his wounds and his heart and lung conditions. He was gassed during the war. Why, they made him the general engineer for the company, and he went all over the world finding mines for them and putting mines in shape for them. And he retired at, was almost 70, and when he was 75, they called him back and asked him to go to Korea, South Korea, to see if a asbestos mine they had there was satisfactory. And he went and stayed several months, he and his wife, at that age. Went up in the backwoods and up in the mountains, and it was a very serious thing for him. And he died not too long after, a couple of years after he came back. But he had that long life of productivity, despite his wounds.
Were all your brothers overseas?
No, he was the only one who went overseas. My one brother was one of the first people, my middle brother, to get the Spanish influenza up at Camp Grant, Illinois, which that's where it first broke out. And he was very, very ill there, and my parents went there and helped take care of the soldiers. And one night, there were, just any number of people died. He was the only one still living in the ward when they went back the next morning. But he lived because he'd always worked on a farm and been very healthy, and they thought that had. Then my other brother was ready to sail. He was at Mineola, New York, ready to sail for France, and some of the boys who were ill, they took them on the ship, but he was not able to go, and the ones who went on the ship died at sea. And he was able to be saved. And again, my parents went to the camp. The government had them come and let them in and let them take care of people, and they never had the flu.
That's amazing. I didn't realize the government had let the parents come.
Well, they wouldn't today.
Yeah.
But they did then.
I suppose they needed all the help they could get at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Were you affected by the rationing?
The rationing in World War II?
In World War I, was there rationing?
No
rationing.
There was shortages, but no rationing. No,
what
nothing.
What kind of things were short?
Well, they had what they call meatless days and wheatless days and all this, and they put out, remember my mother had a cookbook, I think I still have it among my collection, of breads, hot breads, and things that you could make to be patriotic. You had to be very patriotic. And she would, every day we'd have something new that my mother had made, not to use eggs or not to use wheat or not to use sugar. Sugar was scarce. Mm-hmm. And then my mother was in charge of the knitting for the Red Cross, and that was a big thing in those days. And she knitted, I can't begin to tell you how many pairs of socks my mother knitted. And I learned to knit in World War I, although I wasn't very old. And I remember we knitted washcloths for the soldiers. And I don't know, I wasn't a very good knitter then. But I finally graduated touristless. And then when World War II came along, I was in charge of the knitting for the Red Cross here. And again, I knitted the job was for the chairman was to see that the socks were knitted properly and all that. And
your knitting had improved at that point.
Well, I hope so. Yes. And But so you see, I've lived through 3 wars, and I've seen the effects of the rationing in World War II. It wasn't really as serious as people imagined it to be. They said you could only have 3 pairs of shoes. Well, I had never had 3 new pairs of shoes in a year in my life.
So that would have been a bonus.
That would have been a bonus. And we didn't use an awful lot of sugar. And people, I don't know whether people wanted to hoard the sugar or whether they just used a lot of sugar. But we never suffered from not having enough of anything. And with my children, they were small and they were outgrowing shoes. And once in a while I would trade a sugar stamp for a shoe stamp in order for them to have a new pair of shoes. But that was because they outgrew the ones they had. But to say that you actually needed things, I don't feel that it was as bad as...
And you don't feel that people were kind of panicking about not having enough?
Well, they could be. I remember one time in West Grocery Store here in town that there was a shortage of... And I don't remember why it was, whether the bakery didn't get in. See, they had gasoline rationing, and sometimes these trucks couldn't go and all. And there was 1 loaf of bread left on the shelf, and 2 women grabbed it at the same time and tore it apart, and it went on the dirty floor, and nobody got the loaf of bread. And that impressed me with what could happen if people really were desperate for food. Because no one was desperate in Monticello for a loaf of bread. In the Depression, they didn't have school lunches, hot lunches at that time or anything, but the American Legion Auxiliary, and my mother was very active in it, some of these women would fix food for a hot lunch for the children at school. Of course, it was a small school, and not all the children ate there. And my mother would fix up a great big kettle of goulash or beans or something like that, and then she would make tapioca pudding and everything on her day. And I can remember these great huge pans of food that we'd take to school for these youngsters, and there never was any pay for them. You donated it, and the children loved it.
I'm sure. I really appreciate it too,
Yeah.
I'm sure. Well, back to when you were working on the paper in Danville. How long did you stay there?
Well, I went there in 33 and stayed until I was married in 36. I was there almost 4 years.
How did you happen to meet your husband?
Well, I met him at Indiana University. I was doing graduate work, and he was in the senior in the law school. And I was working in an antique shop. And he always said he got me out of an antique shop because some friends of ours, a mutual friend, brought him into the shop and introduced us.
Do you recall your first date?
Yes.
What was it?
He came over to the sorority house, and we went to the movie. And the movie was long. We were late getting there, and then, of course, we dilly-dallied on the way home and stopped and ate and all that. And I almost missed the curfew. And the house mother couldn't understand it. She always said later, she said, I just knew that you loved him. I said, well, not then.
When you were married, what was your wedding like?
Well, we were just married very quietly at my sister's in Danville.
And where did you live then?
I lived in Danville then.
after you were
We
married.
came to Monticello. He lived in Monticello then. He was working here in the law office. And
Where did you live?
we lived in an apartment in a house on East Washington Street, 907 East Washington Street.
Did you go look for a job here then on a paper?
I worked for some time as the correspondent, Pike County correspondent for the Decatur Herald Review, and then later when I also worked for the Courier in Urbana, and then I helped out with the Pike County Journal here sometimes I'd put the paper out, and sometimes they would be short of help, and maybe in between people they'd fire somebody or somebody'd quit until they could get somebody. Then I maybe worked 2 or 3 weeks, and
What were some of the highlights of your career in journalism?
well, I don't know. I interviewed Amelia Earhart one time and introduced her at a lecture series
Where did you?
in Danville. She came on a lecture series, and I got to interview her. And I was very much impressed with her. She always, in her pictures, she looked like she was sort of a rough, her hair was always, but she had beautiful silky hair, blonde hair. She was very tall and very slender, and very kindly. She had the most beautiful hands of anyone I ever saw, and I couldn't imagine being a mechanic on an airplane and having that. And in my story, I said she had drawing room hands. And later, one of the magazines picked that up and used that expression. But that's what they, and she had the most beautiful ermine coat, But she was very charming.
How long was that before she was lost? That would have been
Not very long.
Was it?
Not very long. Mm-hmm.
Was her trip planned at all at that point?
I don't recall that it was. But I remember that one of the reporters on the newspaper had a club, an airplane club. Of course, airplanes were big for the kids in those days, making airplanes. And he had a model airplane club at the Y. And he asked if he might not bring these boys over to visit with her and at least shake her hand. And she was perfectly charming with those boys. She sat down on the floor with them, and they sat around, and she gave them time, which she really didn't have, But she was a very gracious individual. Then Lily Pons came here to Mr. Allert, to see Mr. Allerton's estate one time, and I interviewed her down at the Wabash Railroad Station. And Gertrude Stan, the movie star, probably you never heard of her, but she was quite big in the 30s. She came to Danville, and I interviewed her. And most of those people are very easy to interview.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When you moved to Monticello, what was the town like at that point?
Well, it was very much like it is. The square was entirely different. The square was, that is, the business houses.
We should probably identify now. What year did you move here?
1936. November 1936.
And I think we didn't tell your husband's name either on the table.
Birch Morgan. And he was a practicing attorney here at the time. And there were a number of grocery stores. This is the changes that I think about. It's a whole new ball game nowadays. There was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 6 grocery stores and some meat markets on the public square when I came to Monticello. And today we do not have a food market on the public square. We have Eisner's off the square. They all had delivery. You called up and they delivered your stuff out and had a delivery carts and all that. And had them for years.
What kind of delivery carts were they?
Well, just little, either cars or wagons or, a horse and buggy.
Did most people charge their groceries and pay
yes.
to the month?
Yeah, they charged their groceries. You didn't have and then Elmer Amke started his cash and carry store. And people began to pay cash for groceries because you could buy them a little bit cheaper. And then we turned to where it's cash all the way now. It's entirely different. And the people, several businesses had closed or were closing because of the Depression, and there was a new people coming in. But when you stop to think about it, as you go around the square, the National Bank had not been open very long where it is. Used to be the Moore State Bank. Burgess and Klein was where they are. Bauman, well, it's gone now too, Bauman Hardware Store. Raycraft Drugstore was next door to where it is now. Mr. Gooker was across at the Gooker's Drugstore.
Somebody mentioned to me that...
And I believe that's everybody that continued in business up to the present time, you know.
Somebody mentioned to me that there were a group of buildings and they called it the Levee.
Yes.
that prior to that?
No, the Levee is down where the American Legion Hall is, and along there where Mr. Tedder used to have his real estate and all. And why they call it the Levee, I don't know, except one time the water got up quite high from the river. But anyway, they always call that the Levee.
I was just curious why they called it that. What organizations have you belonged to in Monticello?
I'm ashamed to say too many. I think about everything that's going.
What organizations do you feel like have been most beneficial to you that you've belonged to?
Well, of course, I was very active in the Methodist Church when my children were growing up in the young, from the time they were born until they were grown, in all kind of youth groups. I belonged to the Monticello Women's Club more than 40 years. I've enjoyed that. I was an active member of the Monticello Business Professional Women's Club, one of the charter members, and quite active in it during its 25 years. And we have the street signs in Monticello to thank the Business Professional Women's Club for. We rather like to do things that people thought we couldn't do, and they tried to get street signs and they were too expensive and people didn't want them and everything, and so we started out one evening and went house to house and got enough money to buy the street signs.
When did you form the Professional Businesswomen?
About, I would say 1939, possibly 40. I'm just not quite sure. No, not that early. It was about 45 or 46, something like that. And before that time, I had belonged to the Junior Women's Club. When I first came to town, it was the younger group, and then it dissolved and I went into the senior club. And of course, I've always been active in politics in the Piatt County Republican Women's Club, and very active in political affairs.
What type of things have you done with the Republican Women's Club?
Well, I helped elect my husband a county and circuit judge. No, well, I've held practically all the offices in the club and done all the different things. And then in 1954, Mary Shaw and I were I was the president of the club, and Mary was the county chairwoman. And Doc Fonner from DeLand was the Piatt County Republican chairman. And he said, you girls got to have a candidates luncheon, and you've got to have all the women in the county come in, have all the candidates come in. And we started it, and we still have it. Mm-hmm. We have it and at that time, the candidates themselves came, and then they had such a busy schedule that we turned it over into a candidates' wives luncheon, which was most successful.
Mm-hmm. So you've been on the beginning of lots of interesting events.
And I was active in the PTA. I managed never to be the president. I'd get on the nominating committee and end up by being a vice president because I'd promised the person we wanted to be president that I'd act if they weren't there, and they always came. So
You moved to town before or after the banks had closed?
after, so the banks closed in 33 and I came in 36, and the First National Bank had closed, and the National Bank of Monticello then opened up. Now Mrs. Porterfield can tell you about that because her husband was the.
What type of feelings do people have about that?
Well, the Moore State Bank closed too, and now the First National Bank finally paid out, but the Moore State Bank didn't, and there was quite a feeling against.
Did you have any money in a bank in the Danville area that you lost or anything when the banks closed?
No, our bank in Rossville, the bank's, of course, President Roosevelt closed the banks the minute he got in office. And I went the morning of the inauguration. Was out collecting for my dad with his dairy, and I took some checks into the bank, and I was going to cash them, and I take the money. Mr. Craze, the president of the bank, said to me, "Jesse, I know your dad won't care, and I would rather not cash them. You hold them." And I wasn't sure what it was all about. But the bank closed. However, it opened, and we got the checks cashed. But we might not have. But that money was that tight. And apparently there were people who were taking out their money. I don't know, but I judge from. But he just asked me not to. And it wasn't a great sum of money, maybe $100, I don't know. But as far as, there were people in our small town of 1,500 that were out of work, but they never got to the poverty level that it did in many, many places.
To change the subject a little, when did you decide to write your book?
Well, all my life I'd always wanted to write a book, and I'm not the novel type. And when I was in college, I had a very fine American history professor who won the Pulitzer Prize with his Midwestern history, and he always said I had the ability to write it and the understanding and that I should write something like that. Well, I on, and I came to Monticello, and Piatt County is wealthy in historic lore. I got interested in it and found it most exciting, and still clung to the idea that I'd like to write a history, but I didn't quite have the nerve. And the sesquicentennial came along for the state of Illinois in 1968, 60. We started planning for it before then. And the Board of Supervisors made me the sesquicentennial chairman. And I said, well, I would do it if they would promise their cooperation. And the one thing I thought we should have was a history. And this was our golden opportunity. And they said, fine, we'll back it if you write it. Well, I had laid my cards on the table and I couldn't take them up. So I started out, and I had a wealth of material already, or knew where I could put my hands on it. And I started from there.
How long did you actually spend writing it?
Actually, not too long. I would say the actual writing, 6 months. But gathering the material, years and years and years.
But you had been doing that.
I do it, and I knew if I didn't have my notes, I knew where it was. And I went through every issue of the Piatt County, or the Monticello Bulletin, from 18 76 down to 1935. Went through every issue, and I knew what to look for as I went. That was very interesting and all that. And in 1956, I had edited the centennial edition for the Piatt County Journal, which I had gone through bulletins then and gone back through the history, and so I had a fairly good idea of what I wanted to do. And I laid out my book as I didn't want to write a history book like had been written before, where people write up their families and brag on their families, and I wanted to write a socioeconomic history and show the changes that had come. And I divided into certain sections, and I wanted some artwork, and I went to Larry Zemer, and I said, Larry, we'd done some work in that Pioneer Heritage Center, and incidentally, I helped to start that, and I'm very proud of what we have accomplished there. And I told him what I had in mind, and he said, okay. And in just a short time, he came back with the line drawings that are in my book. I was amazed. They were just exactly what I wanted, but I couldn't have told him that's what I wanted. And when the publisher came from Moline, the publisher's representative came from Moline, and I showed them to him, he was just overwhelmed, and he said, you don't know what you have here. So I think a great deal of the composition of my book, the success of it, is due to Larry's line drawings.
Who were some of the people that were instrumental in helping you gather information?
Well, my book credits the people, Mrs. Musgrove from Mansfield, J.K. Fells, and there were different people, Mrs. Schaefer, Mrs. Schiffer from Atwood, different people in the different communities would give me a line on things. And then we got ready to make an index to the book, and no book is any good unless it does have an index. And I hired a woman from the Chicago area to do the index for us, and she became ill, and she said, oh, it's too much for me. Well, I didn't know what to do. I knew nothing about an index of a book. And I said to my friend Edith Tafflin, Edith, we have to index our book. Well, she said, I don't know anything about an index. Well, we do. I said, well, we'll just start out and look at other indices and see, and we start out, and everybody thinks we got a pretty good index out of it. We were proud of it when it got done.
I bet that took quite a while.
Well, it was it didn't take so long as it was very tiring and very involved. Mm-hmm. But I can see why people don't care to put the index in their book. Mm-hmm. But that was one of the things, and I received many high compliments from the different historians and the historical societies and all for the type of book and the way I developed it, and they all mentioned the index.
When was your book published?
It was published in 1968, and it came off the press in April of 1969, and everything happened. The Salners printing company at Moline was printing it for us, and they were doing a number of the histories. Mm-hmm. And their proofreaders and all would send back word, oh, how interesting. Send us some more, this is interesting. Because some of them were sort of cut and dried. And so I got my pictures together, and the man Bill, I forgot his last name, but Bill was his first name. He said to me, we're going to have to get together and sort out these pictures and see what we can use and all that. And he said, now I'm going to be in Chicago next week. And I said, well, I am too. And he said, well, all right, well, take your suitcase and put your pictures in it and we'll meet. I said, okay. Well, I got to Chicago, but he never got there because there was a strike in Chicago. It was during the strike, the streetcars, the buses. No, the buses were not on strike, but the streetcars and the taxi cab drivers, everything were on strike. You couldn't move in Chicago. And I was at the Lakeshore Club and he had to get to me or I had to get to him someplace. And so he called, he said, well, we'll just have to postpone this. And he said, I've also got some other bad news for you. He said, the company that's binding the book, that binds our books for us, had a big fire, an arson fire that was set. And one of the books, the copy burned up, not of mine, because they didn't have it yet, but I forget the county, but it was over in the western part of the state. And he said, I don't know when they're going to get back in production. It seemed that everything was against me. But we got it out on time, and we had a autographing party at the library, at the community building, and we had a very fine time. I think people were very pleased with the book. They were surprised. I don't think they thought it would be what it was.
How many copies have?
We had 1,100 copies. We were supposed to have 1,000, and they had an overrun and had 1,100 books, and they're all gone.
That's quite an honor.
And they're all autographed with the exception of 2. And these people did not want them autographed.
Oh, I thought maybe you were going to say it was an oversight.
No. And the publisher presented me with a leather-bound book with my name on it. I'm very proud of. No, I've autographed all the books, which they wanted autographed, and I was glad to autograph.
When you were working on your book, did you discover anything in researching that you really didn't expect to find? Is there anything particular surprise in the history?
No, I don't think so, because through the years I'd ceased to be surprised at anything. And it was, I found that my studies of Midwestern history in college under Dr. Bewley had been so thorough that what happens here fit right into that pattern. That we were a typical Midwestern community or county.
We talked about your husband just a moment. How many children did you and your husband have?
We have 2.
And what are their names?
Jerry and Emily.
And where are they located now?
Jerry lives in Edina, Minnesota, and Emily is teaching in Hammond, Indiana.
What was the first radio you recall?
Oh, well, I was in high school, and one of my best friends had a father who was an electrician, and in those days there wasn't too much electrical work, but he was very good at that, and he fixed gasoline engines, and he was quite a mechanic and all. And when the radio came out, well, of course he had to have a radio, so he made this radio. Of course he bought the component parts. And I can remember going to their house and staying up real late at night and getting KDKX from Pittsburgh. That was I would say about 1923. And oh my, the ones that were invited to their house, you know. The rest, we really lorded it over all the other kids at school, you know. And of course, everything was done then to copy the radio. We'd have skits at school, and we'd have false radio programs, you know, and pretend we were broadcasting.
What were some of your favorite radio shows?
Well, I just don't remember too much. Some of the big name bands, and of course, then by 26 or 7, most everybody had radios, and I used to think these soap operas in the afternoon were for the birds. I used to Amanda of Honeymoon Hill and John's Other Wife and Widow Brown something, I don't know. And when I was home after graduating from college and didn't have a job, and my mother enjoyed, she was older, my father, and they enjoyed those programs. It filled in the afternoon for them. Well, I got so interested in them that I was more of a fan than they were, because I'd poke fun at them. But,
it happens that way once in a while.
mm-hmm.
What president do you recall most vividly?
Do I recall most vividly, or the first one?
The one that made the biggest impression on you.
Oh, Herbert Hoover.
Why was that?
Well, and this has always been a mystery to me, but I suppose it's because of our makeup. But Herbert Hoover was able to feed the world in the World War I. He did all the great things that he did. And he came into the presidency at a time when everything had gone real big, and then the bubble burst. He was not responsible for that, but he got the blame. And he lacked the personality to get Congress to work with him. And then Roosevelt came along without any ideas except Hoover's, and because he could do a fireside chat, people went for him. But I think probably the greatest president, greatest man that we had was Herbert Hoover. And I admired him to his dying day, and I still do admire him.
During World War II, we talked about the rationing. Do you recall where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Yes, I do. I was sitting in the Siders, Dan and Carrie Siders' living room in Bement, waiting to go to the Bement show. And Carolyn and I were both very pregnant. Her son was born on Christmas Day, and Emily was born the 11th of January. And I remember that we were sitting there talking, and Birch and Dan came back from uptown and said Pearl Harbor had been bombed. Well, where was Pearl Harbor? Nobody knew, but we soon found out.
What kind of feeling how did people react? Were they scared?
Yes, they were. They didn't know what to expect, because all of a sudden we got these Japanese people in Washington and out at White Sulphur Springs, and we're meeting with them, and they're telling us that they're going to do this and do that and everything, and they're bombing us.
How did World War II affect your life?
Of course, World War II was, we were busy doing war work, and we were affected because our friends were going to war, and they were being taken into foreign lands that they knew nothing about. I remember in studying in school that when we studied geography, we had to learn all the names of all the fjords in Denmark or in Norway. We had to learn every this, that. And we spent about 2 days on the Asia and that part of the world, and yet for 4 or 5 years our interests were centered over in the Asiatic world, and we didn't know where anything was. I yet haven't got things straightened out as to, and you'd read the accounts of the war, and we couldn't fathom the thousands of miles that they covered with the planes and the fighting. And I think one reason why we still do not understand the Asians is that because we were not taught about them. They were just clear over there by themselves, and we should have been paying more attention and know more about them.
How do you feel about Monticello now that you've lived here
46 years.
46 years?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm very proud of Monticello. I think Monticello is quite a town. And I feel that the people, the old-timers, did not appreciate Monticello. They'd always lived here, and they criticized things that happened, and if they had ever lived in other communities, they would realize what wonderful things we have here. And I think another thing that we're very fortunate, we do not have slums. We have and I'm not an anti-racist, don't misunderstand me, but we have our people, our local people who have stayed here or have come in of our own origins. And we have been most fortunate in the last, I would say the last 20 years, 30 years, to have come into our community the great number of young people, young families that we have. And they have come because they've been attracted to Monticello. Our schools, our library, our transportation, our people. And we're centrally located here between Decatur and Champaign, so we are in a metropolitan area, if we want to consider it as such. And I'm very proud of Monticello. I think it's okay, and I think it has grown. We have not suffered growing pains. Our school has been able to absorb our youngsters, and I remember when we had the last bond issue we had for the schools when they built on the addition to the high school, and we had the new grade school. I went out and knocked on doors, and the question that was put to me was, well, why not? Why do we have this? But is it going to be big enough? And that rather thrilled me to think that people were that interested.
We're very positive about it.
Yeah. And I think we're progressive. We're progressive. I don't agree with everything that happens, but then I wouldn't agree with. That's just my policy. I just wouldn't agree with everything. But I am very proud of Monticello, and I think we should appreciate what we have.
So it's really been a good life in Platte County for
It's
you?
really been the good life. That title is the way I feel. Mm-hmm. It's the good life in Platte County.
Well, Platte County's been very lucky to have you too.
Well, thank you. I'm glad to have been here.
Well, I thank you very much for this interview.
All right.